Hello, welcome to another episode of The Thought That Counts. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the 40-hour work week standard and why it needs to change. First of all, what are the origins of the 40-hour work week? Well, the 40-hour work week developed in the industrial era. That's right, well over 100 years ago. In fact, in 1817, a man named Robert Owen coined the phrase 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. So the idea of working for 8 hours a day and having the rest of the time that you're awake to sort of relax and then sleeping for 8 hours every night, that idea has been around for at least a couple hundred years now. Now, this man, Robert Owen, was a labor rights activist back in the day. In the 1800s, American workers would work anywhere from 10 to 16-hour shifts, often working 6-day work weeks, upwards of 100 hours every week. The 40-hour work week didn't become more of a standard until well into the 1900s. In fact, the 8-hour workday had already been established by the early 1900s, but Henry Ford decided to remove one required day of work out of the work week and allow his workers to have a 2-day weekend. He found that productivity did not decrease, but in fact that his workers were more productive during the week. So this became more of a common practice, and in fact it became a standard by law in 1940. Keep in mind, back in 1940, most households only had one worker. They only had one person with actual income. So the 40-hour work week was designed keeping in mind that someone was going to be at home taking care of chores, taking care of the kids, walking them to and from school in the mornings and the afternoons. All of these things are easily possible when one person's working and one person is not. The occurrence of two-income households back then was around 15% of the population. That's very, very few households. Today, by far, it is the norm for households to have multiple full-time workers, especially like a married couple or, you move in with someone, you have a roommate. Both people are usually working. So the standards have completely changed with regards to how our society is behaving, how people are working more, and the fact that women are a lot more prolific in the workplace than they were back in the 40s. And as a matter of fact, today the IRS defines full-time employment as working an average of 30 hours a week or more. So there's still a giant discrepancy between what the IRS defines as full-time employment and what U.S. law mandates as full-time employment for purposes of overtime pay. I'm sure I don't need to remind anybody listening here that there is an abundance of research showing that people who have fewer work hours and more time for sleep, more time for hobbies, more time for family, more time for engaging in leisurely activities and exploring creative arts, people with more time on their hands and fewer work hours per week live healthier lives and are generally happier. This is shown in countless studies dating back to the 70s. In 1974, the United Kingdom had a period of time where for 2 months they had to cut back on work hours that were allowed by people working in those countries, and they reduced the number of work days per week to 3. They only worked 3 days per week for around 2 months in 1974, and they only saw a 6% drop in production. Only 6%. And that was when they lost 2 full days of work time every week. That's not the only study showing that working fewer hours doesn't really lead to much of a drop-off in productivity. In fact, in 2019, a study in Iceland followed companies that were engaging in an experiment where they reduced work hours every week to around 35 hours. And they saw that of the companies participating in this experiment, they didn't see any drop off in productivity. In fact, productivity either stayed the same or it increased. So there's an abundance of evidence showing that working fewer than 40 hours per week actually does not hurt productivity, and it can, in many cases, improve productivity throughout the week. Other studies show that working 40-hour work weeks, people very often waste up to 2.5 hours per day on their phones, on their computer, doing things that aren't really work-related at all. And it's very clear that this trend does not occur when people are working fewer than 40 hours per week. Participants in some of these studies said that when they were talking to their employees about their experiences within the experiment, their employees were saying things like, yes, we feel less drained, our productivity is up because we know that we're getting Friday off or whatever it might be, or they're getting off early that day, and they have more of a heads down workflow where they're focused more throughout the day than they were if they were just working, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, the normal 40-hour work week, where you kind of like, you drag yourself in and you feel very casual and you just feel drained all the time. Instead, they were feeling much more motivated and much more efficient. Another person involved in one of these studies said that it changes the focus from hours worked to productivity. That is, changing the focus from, quote, busy work to the right work. So everyone who participates in these kinds of studies actually enjoys working fewer hours, productivity stays up or it improves, and everyone's living a healthier, happier lifestyle. So why do we still have this 40-hour work week? What is the real reason here? The only reason I can really come up with is that doctors and health experts and economists who are involved in these kinds of studies aren't involved in the decision-making process for how to regulate workplaces in the U.S. They're not involved in what kinds of standards should be set for employment. An article by the BBC details how a 2021 study that followed Swedish workers for over a decade showed that reduced working hours also reduced stress, exhaustion, negative emotion. It increased productivity, and it also showed that cutting work hours by 25% improved sleep and lowered stress. While another study from the 1990s showed that working only 6 hours a day improved workers' family lives. So there are seemingly endless studies showing that working fewer than 40 hours actually improves everyone's lives. And furthermore, the idea of a 40-hour work week is a fallacy. You spend way more than 40 hours a week on the fact that you have a job. When you consider the fact that you have to get up early, you shower, you got to scarf down breakfast, you get dressed in your professional clothing, you drive across town to work, you're there for 3.5 or 4 hours before you take a lunch break and then get back to work for another 4 hours or so, and then you drive all the way back across town. I have actually been calculating this in my own personal life, and I've had several different jobs in several different locations, different types of work. And I have never had a job that cost me less than 10.5 or 11 hours a day. From the time that I am getting ready for work that morning to the time that I get home in the afternoon or the evening, about 11 hours has passed. So it's not really a 40-hour work week, is it? It's closer to 50 or 55 hours a week when you consider everything involved and the fact that you have that job. Yes, we're there for 8 hours a day, but we take a 30-minute or an hour-long lunch break. We only need that much time on a break because we're there for so long that day. If we worked, let's say, just take part-time jobs, for example, you're working like 4.5, maybe 5 hours a day, you don't really have a long break in the middle of that, do you? You might have a 15 or 20-minute break at best, and you don't really need a long break because you're not there for 8 hours. So working fewer hours has more benefits than just, getting better sleep at night and having an extra couple hours to watch TV. It has kind of a compounding effect where the more time you spend at work, the more breaks you have to take. There's built-in breaks by law by virtue of the fact that you're going to be there for 8 hours working. If you're only there for 5 or 6 hours working, then the legally mandated break times and the mentally required break times too are going to be a lot less. So you're going to be spending less time on breaks and less time wasting time because you're going to be working for fewer hours. And furthermore, simply restructuring the workplace is going to have a very positive impact on how much time you have every day, aside from even reducing work hours. I'll give you an example. Working from home would reduce the amount of time that you spend commuting. Having different standards for the types of clothing you are supposed to wear and things like that would cost you less time preparing for work in the mornings. So there's a lot of ways that we can adjust our employment standards aside from just reducing the number of hours worked. Although I do believe that reducing the number of hours worked will have a very positive impact as well, especially if you consider all these studies that I've been reading from showing that that's true. I think at the end of the day, what we really need is for health experts, economists, and everyone else that's ever been involved in one of these studies to be involved in the lawmaking process regarding employment standards and what should be defined as a full-time job, what kind of wages should be handed out for different levels of work regarding how many hours you work per week, and at what point should you be receiving overtime pay? Should it be the 40 hours that it is currently, or should it be reduced to 30 hours to meet the standards that the IRS has set forth with the definition of full-time employment? I think working 6 hours a day is a lot more reasonable. It would give us a lot more time on our hands. We'd be able to engage in hobbies and we'd have more family time and we'd have more time to go to the grocery store. We wouldn't have to take time off of work just to go to the doctor's office. I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with our employment standards today. And ideally, we would be seeing a change in that in the coming years. I'm hoping for a full-on workplace revolution that changes these standards in the long run. Ideally, we would have health professionals and doctors and economists work together with the lawmakers in order to give us employment standards that are better for our lives, better for our health, better for our families, so that we can live happier, healthier lives in the long run. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that sleeping for the right amount of time and having the right amount of unwinding time at the end of the day are both very important factors in whether or not you feel fulfilled or whether you feel stressed out and drained all the time. And hopefully we can get to a place in the near future where nobody has to feel like that throughout the week, because worker burnout is a very serious problem in this country. And another way that we can help foster this workplace revolution is by talking about something called wealth redistribution. And I'm planning on talking about that in another episode coming very soon. I appreciate you listening to this episode of The Thought That Counts. Please like if you liked it. Please leave a review. Please give me some feedback. I would love to hear your thoughts. And I know that my darling fiance, Casey, has not been able to join us for the past couple episodes, but she's going to be joining us for another episode real soon. So you stick around so you can make sure you get all of her thoughts and opinions on these things as well. Thank you for listening, and I hope that I see you again soon.